All right, those of you whose faces I can see and those whom I can't, welcome. I'm Deborah Wright, one of the principals with PneuMatrix. My techie guru here is my partner in crime in PneuMatrix, Jim Kitchens. Thank you. He's going to do better than I do. I'm notorious for leaving people in the waiting room when I'm in charge, and he will let people in as they arrive. Many of you have been on several of these weekly webinars. This is our last in a series of 8. We have shown different emerging models for sustainability and innovation with smaller churches. And I had people all from the beginning said, why are you making us wait for the merger one? We've been waiting for 2 months for the merger conversation. And I knew that's why I kept you sort of teasing you out. Today, we have with us 2 people, as I said, the 2 Kathys, both with a C. Kathy Chisholm, who's the executive presbyter at Kendall Presbytery, which is in Idaho. And she's our example of several examples, but one in particular of exploring mergers that are with several denominations. And Kathy Hoop, who is still a pastor of a merged church in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, which has a fascinating backstory. So let me open us with prayer, and then I'll get us started. Let's pray. God of graciousness, God of incomparable love, God of creativity, we give thanks for the imagination that you have gifted us with, through which we can begin to sense and discern the work of your Holy Spirit among us in ways that we frankly haven't imagined before. We pray that you would use the work of these webinars and the shared covenant that we have with one another as colleagues in ministry to begin to plant seeds of rebirth and regeneration among our churches in ways that they may need that we don't imagine. We pray that you would be with our congregations in their sorrow and their grief over their decline, and help them to find seeds of hope in the fact that we are resurrection people. In Christ's name, amen. So we welcome the 2 Kathys today for our final emerging model, and it is about mergers. And as I said, I built it as the good, the bad, and the ugly, because mergers have all 3 of those in them. And we wanted to have a very frank conversation. I will tell you that PneuMatrix is working in a couple of different current explorations of mergers right now. And I had a conversation recently with a church that said, they were talking to both sides of the possible merger discussion. And one of them said, well, I said, how did it start with you? He said, well, we got a letter in the mail from a church that says, we would like to merge with you. We've looked at all the churches that are possible and we picked you. And I thought, okay, that's more adoption language. And there are actually Protestant denominations that have adoptions. We don't tend to use that language and don't have that model, but we have things that look like that model. Anyway, we're going to look at sort of the whole spectrum of good, bad, and ugly about mergers. And as a part of this grant, as you know, as I repeat every week, is that this is part of a Designing for the New Norm grant that is co-sponsored with PneuMatrix and the Synod of the Pacific, where we said, you know, we need to start looking at our smaller churches, our fragile churches, to see what kind of models we can bring them that they can discern whether it fits their DNA, whether it fits their calling, whether they sense the work of the Holy Spirit in them. And it's all over the map. And we started with a pilot project a couple of years ago in Cascades Presbytery, which is most of Oregon. We had, of their 92 churches, we had maybe a third of them involved that were 100 members or fewer, which is common. We moved that, we tweaked the approach then and took it to all of the presbyteries in our synod, and had a really good time working individually with many of those churches too. And then we said for the third phase, we wanted to take it national and open it up to the denomination. So we've done that first with a launch on September 22nd with Jeffrey McDonald, who's the author of Part-Time is Plenty, which if you weren't with us in on that, I bring that to your attention. The book Part-Time is Plenty is a wonderful resource for congregations, especially as they're trying to navigate that first time of having less than a full-time clergy, because that changes the psyche of a congregation sometimes. So I commend that to you. And also, I will say, for those of us, our bigger audience is with people who are watching the video recordings of these webinars, and they are being archived. I think you just threw the link in there, didn't you, in the chat? So grab that link. After all this series is over, and maybe after I take a rest for a little while, I'm going to send out a launch to people, because at the beginning, we sort of we assumed that what people would want would be cohorts, ongoing cohorts and stuff, and we asked at the beginning in our polls, you know, what kind of follow-up do you want? Do you want an ongoing cohort about this model? Do you want a toolkit or toolbox setup of resources? Do you want sort of a private Facebook page, et cetera? And it's surprising to me, because, and I think because we sort of started thinking that this before COVID, but everyone says, I am cohorted out. And they sort of said, we started cohorts the beginning of COVID, and they're wonderful. And I don't, for two reasons, I don't have time in my schedule to attach myself to another ongoing cohort. But number two, we're exploring several models at once, and I can't afford to have a cohort on each one going on. So we said, okay, we'll work on toolkits that we are hoping to, right now, they'll be lodged at our PneuMatrix website, but we would like to be open source about it and share it more widely with the denomination. We're looking to see where in the denominational structure that best fits, and see if we can say, hey guys, put the structure for a toolkit together. We will provide the content for you to put out to people. We'll see how that goes. Anyway, I'm going to put up a short poll. She says, looking to see where it is. Ta-da. Hold on. I think I have to go to others. Polls. There it is. And I'm poll number 8. Pardon me. Mergers. There we go. If you will quickly answer these two questions. The first one is a single choice. The second is any or all of the above. Can you all, there, I'm just launching it now. Let me know if you can see it. Can you guys see that one? Great. Weigh in on that. And it just gives us a sense of who the audience is, so we can answer questions in the direction of who the audience is, and see whether any of you are involved at any level yet of any, or have war stories about mergers, or victory stories too. Just scroll down if you want to see the second question. I'll give it another 30 seconds, and then we'll end the poll. Thank you, folks. We don't have any COM folks on yet today, but in the past, and some of our others, we've had folks that saying our COM is looking for models of how to serve this set of congregations best. So, all right. And let me just make the distinction that we are looking at today, two models. One is an interdenominational and one is intra-denominational. So one has to do with merging with congregations that are of several denominations, which is a common theme these days, especially in sort of rural areas. And then the interdenominational is intra-denominational thing too, is looking at a PCUSA partner for merger. All right. Okay, let me see. I have all but Jim and I think have weighed in. So I'm going to share the results just so you can quickly see who we are. We're about half clergy, half laity. That's a good sign. And we're folks who are really interested in exploring. That's what we hoped for. So I will stop sharing that, and it will go into our archive. And let me get that down. Close the poll. Okay, so I'm going to ask that you post questions in the chat that you would like addressed at any point during this. We won't do the questions till we've heard both Kathy's stories, and I've asked a question or two, and then we'll hit the chat for some questions that you've posted. I'm going to start with Kathy Chisholm, who is the executive presbyter for the Presbytery of Kendall, which is mostly in Idaho, or it is most of Idaho, I should say. And she has, I know, worked in conversations about at different, so that, you know, she can show you the different process sort of issues that come up about working with other denominations in that one. So Kathy, if you could share with a bit, you sent me in your latest email all of the best questions. So questions are more important than answers in my book. So that's what we've got to deal with today. What have you got for us?
Unmute. So the latest conversation that, and it's in the context of mergers, it's very early in the process, and we're not sure where it will head. But it was actually begun by the Bishop of the United Methodist Church for the Western region, who contacted me, and it also involves the Episcopal bishop for this region. And all three of us have churches in Salmon, Idaho, which is about 3,000 people, who none of whom have had a pastor there for a while. We had a CRE that was driving 2.5 hours one way twice a month, did that for 8 years and left in April. The Methodist Church had a pastor for a while. The Episcopals hadn't had a priest for a long time. So she initiated a conversation about none of these three churches was likely to ever have a resident pastor, especially not full-time. And yoking is not an option because each one is not close to any other church of their denomination. You have to, this is a logging, mining community, some recreation. It's close to the river of no return. So a lot of ups and downs in the economy. So the question that we started with is, would it work if these three churches pooled their resources to have one pastor serve all three churches? And at first, the conversations were just among ourselves to say, could we work it out as far as denominational polity and theology? What, where would they be, to whom would a pastor be accountable? How would we, search for one? And then we brought it to, we each had some conversations with the individual congregations. And then last May had a meeting with representatives from each, the district superintendent, the Episcopal bishop, and I met with them just to get a feel for whether they thought this was possible and how it might work and all that. So they had proximity to each other because they were in the same small town. There was, of course, some shared culture. There'd been some history in the past of the Methodists and the Presbyterians working together. There'd been a time when the Episcopals and the Presbyterians had shared a pastor. So there was some sense of shared, ministry and history. They were all in similar circumstances of not being able to financially support a full-time or maybe even a part-time pastor. Most of the Presbyterians probably had the least viable building, but the other two were in good shape that way. And then they would have they would have the support of the denominational leadership. But then it comes down to questions of identity. One of the first questions that you get is, which version of the Lord's Prayer would we use? And the Presbyterians wanted to still be able to ring their bell at 11 o'clock because that meant that the Presbyterians were in town. That was one of their traditions. The housing would be an issue. The Episcopal Church has a very nice manse, but they use it as part of their mission, so that somebody who has a housing emergency or somebody who is visiting in town, they have that. So they really didn't want to give that up for housing. And then you get into what kind of time of service. It's so then, and it became interesting in the conversation in that meeting. We actually had came with a kind of a draft of what a position description might look like for somebody to do that. But one of the responses to how would this work out because there wouldn't be equal time among the three. There were different size and different needs. And the question was asked something like, well, how do you think things would be different? And one guy very honestly said, we'd all want this person to do everything for us, more than one person could do. And they'd all wanted, and after we got to the point in the conversation where we said, we've worked it out, so yes, whatever denomination, we think that person could, do the sacraments, whatever, in each of the other two. And one of the congregation members there said, well, if a pastor could, from other denominations, could help lead, serve each one, why couldn't a layperson? Why couldn't the Episcopal music leader lead worship for the Presbyterians, or somebody from the Presbyterian church lead, assist in something with the Methodist church? So, and they said, we're kind of used to being do-it-yourself churches. Some of them had been without for so long that they said, yes, we need a priest to come in once in a while, like once a month or whatever, or the Presbyterians needed a moderator of session and those kinds of things. So the way it was left was that that during the summer, they would worship together 3 times, once in each of the 3 churches, and continue the conversation. And so that's kind of where it still is. We're not quite sure where it's going to go. The Presbyterians are basically, they have a moderator who lives on the other side of the state who zooms in for session meetings. And they meet on Sundays, and one guy brings his guitar and they have a little bit of singing, and they read the scriptures, and they drink coffee, and they pray. And their passion is keeping their fellowship hall as open to minister for an after-school program that meets there 4 days a week for the county. So we're just, that's how far it is. But those questions that you have to work out about identity and how are you going to share resources, how are you going to actually allocate things like that. Some of it depends on timing. We had another congregation that began having conversations with a nearby Lutheran church about possibly shared ministry or cooperative ministry. The Presbyterians ended up selling their building in order to continue as a congregation, and are now nesting with the Lutherans. So they're kind of two congregations sharing the same building, and every once in a while somebody assumes that that means they're going to merge, but they seem to be. I don't think the Presbyterians say the Lutherans are too much by the book, too attached to the liturgy, and but they did teach them to have a coffee hour. So those are kind of the observations that I have, that you've got to. Will the congregations buy in? I was, do it. Does it make sense to them? Can they make it work? Mm-hmm. And why? What kind of resistance is there, and what form is it going to take? And then how do you work out those identity issues about the traditions that people want to hold on to?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. And that's a hard road. We started before the rest of you got on the call too. I said, where are things at with this conversation? Because I've been part of hearing and being kept in the loop since the beginning of the conversation. Is like, I don't know where this is going. But as she said, I think it's a changeover in the Episcopal bishop. That can kind of send everything back to square one.
Yeah, the district superintendent changed in July. There's an entirely new bishop for the Episcopal Church. I'm the only one that was still part of the original three. So I'm not, and I haven't been able to, I haven't talked to either of those two yet. So that's a key, is timing and who's in place at the right time, at the right place to help nurture it along, those conversations along.
It is. And it brings up the whole other set of, you've hit on some of the worship ones, which I think are key, because those are the ones that are visceral inside our people of, I want to say the Lord's Prayer this way or whatever. But also they're the structural questions of like, okay, whose building is in good shape, and whose isn't, and which are the right responses in looking at the best and highest use of facilities. And of course, there's all of the emotional attachment and nostalgic attachment to particular buildings. So thanks for laying out all those questions for us. We'll come back to you with some more questions. I want to get Kathy Hoop's story in Tuscaloosa on the boards, and then I will start posing some questions together. So Kathy's in Tuscaloosa with what was Covenant Church and University Church and is now Grace Church. So take it away.
Thank you. So I went to Tuscaloosa to be the pastor of University Presbyterian Church, which was a small, very small church on the edge of the University of Alabama campus. Tuscaloosa is a city of about 100,000 people, and it had 6 Presbyterian churches, and each one kind of had their own niche. There was the First Presbyterian Church with all the big staff and all the programming. There was Bethel, which was the little country church. There was Brown Memorial on the campus of Stillman College, and then a Korean Presbyterian Church. And then there was Covenant Presbyterian and University Presbyterian. And the two of us had actually a lot in common, although the University Church was a very bold church. It had been very active in civil rights issues, especially in helping with the campus there. You may be familiar with the story of the stand in the schoolhouse door. And so that the University Church was very open and welcoming of all people and took a stand for civil rights there. And then they became also the church that was very outspoken on affirming the LGBTQ community and became a more like Presbyterian church. And so I came to this church knowing that was their history and their bold witness. And yet this, every merger is so unique, and every set of circumstances is unique. And ours was very, very unusual. This church had originally just been campus ministry and then became a church, and then had campus ministry taken off of their plate. So they were there and a little unsure of their identity other than being that bold witness in Tuscaloosa. And as after I'd been there for a little while, we started to grow, but we had nowhere to go. We were literally a block and a half from what people refer to as the cathedral, the stadium of the University of Alabama for their football team. So we were in the shadow, and we're surviving with football game day parking, which was essentially paying my salary. So it was a very difficult situation to be in. No parking. We didn't really look like a church. People couldn't really find us, and we had nowhere to grow. And we're also one of those interesting little buildings where when you walk into it, you're in the sanctuary, and so you can't just kind of sneak in and visit. You're just right there in front of God and everybody. And with this friendly little church, everybody would come up and say hello to you, and might just scare you out the door. So it was an interesting problem we had as we started to grow and had nowhere to go. And as it happened, the Covenant Church, which was maybe 2 miles away, was dying, and that is their own language. I mean, they had been the multi-staff church with a big property, and they had just been aging out. They'd had a series of things happen with nothing horrific, but some disagreements over leadership and some just just some things that caused attrition, and even children of members who grew up and left and went to other churches. I mean, Tuscaloosa is one of those southern cities where there's not just a church on every corner, there's a church halfway down the block as well. And so the choices are vast, and the non-denominational churches were really soaring there, as in so many places. So this Covenant Church was struggling, and we decided to get together just to see if we could do some summer programming together. But it was out of that conversation that we started to say, maybe we need each other. And that's what emerged, was from a dialogue about sharing programming, that maybe we could help each other out. We were landlocked and had no space in which to grow. They had space, but they also were in transitional time with a pastor, and in the process of searching for a pastor. And so they were willing to put that search on hold so that we could explore the possibility of merger, which was a huge risk for them to take, to say, yes, we will pause in our search and entertain this conversation. And we took almost 2 years to explore the possibility of merger. Deborah, I saw that you posted in the chat the book Better Together, and I see where it's also been just recently updated and revised. Yep. That was kind of our Bible, Better Together, and that was our guiding question. Could we be better together? That's going to guide us in our conversations. And if the answer is no, then we part as friends. But if the answer is yes, then let's take it another step, and then we'll take it another step. And we really kind of embrace this idea of let's date a little bit and see how it goes. But I will say, before we ever even started dating, we got our 2 sessions together and said, let's get to know each other a little bit, which we did. And I was really proud of the session of University Presbyterian, because I didn't ask any of the LGBTQ members around that session table to tell their stories or to share who they are, but they just did. And that, I think, was a very bold and important step for them to say, this really is who we are. We're not just saying we welcome everybody, but everybody's here around this table, and we're already here. And so if you're not comfortable with that, that's important for us to know now. And we said, what are the deal breakers? And there were some who thought we shouldn't use that language, that was scary language to use. But I felt like it was important language to use, because there were things that we knew we couldn't compromise on. We weren't going to compromise on being an open and affirming congregation. And they needed to know that. And we needed to know if they had any deal breakers like that, which they actually said they didn't, and I think that was true. They really didn't have anything that they were fearing losing, other than, I think, their name. That that was their fear. We're going to lose our name. We're going to lose this history. But for us, for university, we were an unusual church. We had weekly communion, which of course is not that common for most churches. Very much attached to using inclusive and expansive language. The good thing was that as we had these conversations and as our dating progressed, we were able to find out that their history was not really unlike ours. They had had leadership that had introduced similar ideas, similar theology. They had just kind of drifted away from it because they didn't have the leadership. And what we saw was that we had a lot in common. And I think one of the big reveals for us was in Alabama, predatory lending is horrific. Interest rates exceed 350%. And so predatory lending is a big issue that a lot of churches across denominations work together on. And there was a big rally at one of the Baptist churches. We showed up, they showed up. Neither of us knew the other was coming. We both brought the same number of people. And that was one of those, we didn't know you cared moments. And so it was one of those, well, we just didn't know each other. And so it really was about taking the time to get to know each other and discover our compatibility. And that's what really made this work, was exploring the fact that we did already share so much in common. We had just never talked about it. I think that the dating metaphor kind of worked well for us. And I would say that, there were those who said, this is taking way too long, let's just get it over with. And there were those who were saying it's going way too fast, we need to slow down. I mean, there was no way that everybody was going to be happy with the speed of it. But the good advice I'd gotten was, take it as slowly as you possibly can. And that's what we did until it almost got too painful. I think it kind of reminded me of like when you are in that relationship and you're like, all of a sudden you're like, why aren't we just living together? This is miserable to say goodnight every night and go home to our own houses. We need to be under the same roof. And so I think that's good that we develop that yearning. It's like it's time to be together under one roof. And then you move in and you realize, oh man, there's so many things we didn't talk about. Like, we didn't think that you would not take down all the pictures of all the old pastors. We didn't think we'd have to say that to you because this isn't Covenant Presbyterian anymore, and those aren't the pastors that served this church. So there were things that we didn't think about as far as what it would be like to actually live under one roof together. But that's where more of the good conversations take place over those things. Like, well, how do we take down the sign? And how do we take down the sign without hurting somebody's feelings, even though it's time to take down the sign? So I think I will say we had a really strong team of people from both congregations that were the merger oversight team that worked very honestly, sometimes long into the night with very heartfelt conversations. And we just decided we were not going to be afraid to say what needed to be said and to say it with love and trust. And we did bring in, we brought in mediators to work with. I specifically brought in mediators with my congregation to let them process their fears and grief early on, and so that they could talk with people who they knew didn't have a dog in the fight, not to sit down in small groups with elders, but to sit down in a small group with an independent mediator who could just be present and unanxious, so they could say all their fears and anger and grief and everything. And it was fascinating. Some of those groups were weeping, while across the room, another group was celebrating and already brainstorming new names for the church. And that was just within one congregation. So, we had the whole spectrum of emotions going on, and we paid a lot of attention to how do we say goodbye How do we close a building? I'd been through a fire when I worked at Second Presbyterian, where Jim came to serve after the fire and had to rebuild that church. But we learned how to say goodbye to a building, and how do you say thank you to a space, and honor the time that you've had in that space, and recognize that that you're letting go and moving forward. So I think it took a lot of emotional effort and on everyone's part, and a lot of honesty and listening. But we've had another wonderful, successful merger here in our presbytery, 2 churches, one again that was aging and dying, and another that was just really thriving. And they had a lot of hard decisions to make, but the sale of the property that they gave up also brought in millions of dollars, and they are now distributing that money to various ministries within our presbytery, making a huge difference for our camp and conference center, for our children's home, where they're building tiny homes for people who have who are blind, visually impaired, or hearing impaired, building tiny homes for them where they can live on a campus together. So the sales of some of these properties has just brought about really incredible gifts for doing some powerful ministry.
There's so many parts of that story. I want to start by confessing something about Paul Greer. Paul, who is, to me, one of the greatest gifts we have at the Presbyterian Foundation as a resource guy. He's head of Project Regeneration. And he has always said, he said, that merger in Tuscaloosa, I wouldn't have put a plug nickel down if that was going to ever work. And he was looking at it on paper. He said, like, this very progressive, more light church and this much more traditional church, and how are you going to blend it? And clearly Kathy's done a great job, and the elders there too. I will also tell a story that when PneuMatrix came in to work with both of them after they were merged and had become Grace Church, we had conversations still at that point about losses and grief work and things. And I'll never forget, it was a woman elder from what had been Covenant Church. And she started to cry in one of the meetings, and she apologized, said, I have no idea where this is coming from. And then she thought, no, yes, I do, but I'm surprised by it. And she said, one of the things that I grieved that I had no idea was so deep in me was that we no longer say the Apostles' Creed every Sunday. We say portions of different creeds. And she said, I grew up from the infancy on in a church that always said the Apostles' Creed. And the fact that that is gone from my liturgy as a constant still triggers tears in me. And I thought that's very profound when you talk about sacred spaces in us. Now, in your case, university sold its property, probably the more valuable of the 2 properties, if it's right next to the campus, I would guess, and in worse shape. And I've worked with other churches that try to say, whose property are we going to live in? Jim has posted in here great wisdom that we got from Corey Schlosser Hall when he was still in Washington State. And he said, first thing you got to know is that there are 3 mergers going on. There's incarnational, ecclesiastical, and legal. Approach them in that order. Because while you may really be thinking through, or you have people on your boards that are thinking through the ecclesiastical and the legal aspects, none of it makes any sense if you don't get the incarnational one down. And Kathy's done a good job of describing, the incarnational journey that her 2 churches went on to become this 3rd church. Kathy Chisholm has described what I'm guessing will somehow be bogged down by all the execs involved and the bishops and the district people around on those other 2 sides, and saying, wait, this is an incarnational merger if it's going to work. I have been working over a period of 2 years off and on with 2 congregations in Santa Rosa, which is just north of where I live here in California. And we had the opposite of one that you were suggesting, Kathy, where in this case, a Lutheran church, Thanksgiving Lutheran, sold their property. It was not in good shape, and they were very tiny and couldn't afford anymore. They sold their church and began to just nest. And it was really a landlord-tenant nesting when it first began in Knox Presbyterian Church, which was nearby. And they kept, being really clear. Oh, no, we're just nesting. Right around COVID, the Presbyterian Church lost its leadership to retirement. And so things were up in the air. What are we going to do? Well, when COVID hit, the Lutherans provided a pastor who could pastor to both churches. They were still the pre-COVID having 2 worship services. Because of COVID, they started worshiping together online, virtually, and they got to know each other better that way. And that started a process of how are we doing it, living together consciously rather than landlord-tenant wise. When I was brought in to start consulting with them, the one rule that the Lutherans gave me says, do not use the M word with us. The M word is a 4-letter word here. We are not going to be merging. This is not what this is about. Don't ever use it. Well, I got an email recently this week. He said, they kind of want to tiptoe into the merger conversation now. And so it really is that kind of a journey. Yeah, both of you have used the illustration of sort of the marriage. And I think that it's not like simple marriage, it's like blended family marriage. It's like yours, mine, ours, all of the complexities of the relationship, not just the 2 that are at the altar getting married. And in Better Together, which I see I have a typo in, but that's the book and you get the gist. They talk about the notion of the fact that you need to learn and say, is one church going to go into the property of another? It's the same thing you do in a blended family situation. Or do we need to vacate both properties and go to a third neutral property? I've seen that happen too. So there are lots of different ways to go. Better Together, as you say, Kathy, Hoop is the Bible because it asks all the right questions and it's process oriented about, have you thought of this yet? Have you thought of that yet? That's the kind of resource that's just so valuable for us. They talk about in Better Together, 4 different types of mergers. A rebirth merger, which is where you have a struggling or a dying church trying to get its second life by being absorbed. And it's kind of like what in the business world we would have called really an acquisition more than a merger. They talk about adoption mergers. I mentioned that before, where sort of struggling churches out there saying, will you please adopt me? Those are very common even in non-denominational models of where you begin to get multi-site worship centers, especially in the mega churches, but we're beginning to see those within our denomination as well, of what if we adopt them and we, instead of the old model of how you used to a plant where you take a few of the leadership of your church and you go plant them in a new place, usually a new suburb or something back in the day, and they would, be supported by you. This is the opposite of that. Or let's adopt this church that is struggling and see whether we can do a transformational process or have a ministry which is kind of a tentacle out from the main post. Marriage mergers where they're both strong and growing, but they still think that they're better together and they want to do a turnaround early on in that stage. And then what they call ICU mergers, where it's about intensive care, whether it's 2 churches that are white knuckling their way, trying to figure out whether they need to close, they're both in trouble, and they're trying to figure out whether they can survive if they throw in together. It's harder for that 4th model to work. The statistics say that if you take 2 of those sort of ICU churches, within about 5 years after the merger, they're back down to the size of what one of them was before the merger. And a lot of that is because of attrition by death. They were aging out churches to start with, and they continued to age out and work their way back down to a size that was there before. A couple of questions I want to say is, Kathy Hoop, I know yours started with a question about, can we do Vacation Bible Church together? Can we do some program together? So it was almost accidental, although, no, I mean, let's say it's synchronistic rather than accidental. It was that notion of, oh, well, this can go to deeper questions. I think that the important thing is for us to look at what are the signs of intentionality that we can be, so that we aren't defaulting close to death in our merger situations, but we are looking and saying, wow, that could happen. Do you have any signals for that, of what kind of things you see going on in the congregation? And the second question I want to ask, so pick which one you want to answer first, and both of you, is that notion of a church whose building is going to get sold. Let's say they are going into one of the 2 churches and the other is going to be sold. That question of we're bringing the dowry to the table, if you will. How does that go down, and how does that get integrated? It's like in a blended family or marriage of your money and my money becoming our money, or in your case, as you're describing, Kathy, the presbytery's money, and in the other one that happened in your presbytery. Give us some hints about that.
So I think it's interesting that one of the big fears that emerged very quickly was who's telling us to do this. The presbytery must be telling us to do this. And I think that came out of a previous generation of, sometimes presbyteries did encourage churches to explore this because it's a good idea. And so there was all this fear initially of someone's telling us to do this and they want our money. They want the money. And that was what came out of my congregation, was that this presbytery is telling us to do this. They've been trying to get rid of us, and this is how they're going to get rid of us. This is how they're going to silence us, and then they're going to take the money. It was really hard for me to convince them, no matter how many people I got to back me up on this from the trustees of the presbytery, to convince them that no one was taking the money, that this was not coming from anyone. It frankly, the conversation that the person I was talking with, Deborah, was that person who had cried so much over the Apostles' Creed. She was the partner in this whole conversation, who went back to her church and said, we've got to talk to them about a merger. I do think that when I came to University Press, so you were talking about signs and what are the signs? When I interviewed with them before they'd ever hired me, they talked to me about their context, and it was a sad conversation. They were really afraid and unsure and did not know what their future was, if any. And so when I interviewed with them, I asked them, would you ever consider moving? Because of the problems they were naming. They knew the problems before I ever came. And so I said, you know what? I think you need to ask yourselves, would you ever consider moving? Would you ever consider a new location? And I said, would you ever consider a different name for yourselves? I brought those questions to my interview because of what they had already seen. And they were an intelligent conversation. They knew what road they were on already before I got there. So it just was a matter of responding to the problems they'd already named before they called me. And now when we did start to explore it, then some of them started to freak out a little bit. But I reminded them, I said, no, do you remember I asked you these things before you ever called me as your pastor? We discussed these very things. Now, we were trapped for a little while because we had the campus student center, but because First Presbyterian Church met in that student center and rented it from us as part of what we were told we had to do, we couldn't move until they decided they were moving. So when they moved campus ministry, that completely freed us up to explore those questions, to address those problems. But they were the ones who knew it. I mean, and I think if a congregation is given that opportunity to say, what do you think your future is from 5 years from now? They can say it. I mean, the Covenant Church was saying, we are dying, we know it. I mean, they were all very honest. And I think they just need somebody to give them the space to name their truth.
Yeah. Good. Kathy?
Yeah, the money thing too. Yeah, never mind. The money thing. Yeah.
Well, I had been having conversations with the Presbyterian Church there in Salmon for several years, and they knew they were dying. And I had been trying to give them various options of what they could consider doing, including, you know, could explore, you know, some sort of shared ministry, or you know, is there a way to find other partners in the community to help keep this after school program going? So I think what you know, one of the reasons that the lay pastor who had been working with them was he felt that he had done all that he could do there. I think part of what we were trying to do as the I don't know, the chiefs, the denominational officers, was to give them permission to say, here's an option you can explore. It makes sense to us that sharing resources so that there is a resident minister available in, you know, for all three. But it has to work, you know, for you. And so what we were trying to say was, we've worked it out among us that we think that we can see it being a possibility, but now it's going to be up to you to, you know, to explore and see whether it does make sense, and how much you want, how far you want to go with it. So one other merger that I'm familiar with was in El Paso, where 3 churches, PCUSA churches, merged. They did, and there had been a history of all of the Presbyterian pastors meeting together, and then we had a year. We kept asking, what does God intend for the future? And we had a year of every Sunday evening, everybody meeting for a service of evening prayer. And anyway, it followed out of that 3 of the congregations took it further, started worshiping together, did some joint things. One of them really needed to sell their building. I mean, it was just not going to be maintainable. But in the end, they decided they would put all 3 buildings up for sale. And I think the original intention was then do a whole different building. But the 2 least desirable buildings sold first and fairly quickly. And then they ended up in the most accessible and the newest building. And they named their church Grace also. So, and the other timing was that all 3 of those were served at the time part-time by women pastors who were at the point where they either wanted to retire or move on. And so there was a good timing to then also call new pastoral leadership.
That's so good. I'm just looking at the chat, and I don't know what human being is attached to the Calvary Denver. Who is that over here? I'm looking to say, oh, there you are. Okay. I like what you posted about the landlord tenant thing, and where you are with a UCC congregation in Denver. You're right about the anxiety being like, well, if we take one step, it's the jump off the cliff, and it's
Right.
sort of, there's only one landing. The consulting work that PneuMatrix does in the field of merging intentionally is designed with exit ramps. And so you have 3 phases where, like, we're going to come to these marker points, you know, and at this marker point, everybody gets to decide if they still want to be in the game or if they want to leave. If you want to leave, no harm, no foul, still friends. And we will work with you all to figure out what your other options are. And so there's the notion of being able to, you know, it's not a prearranged marriage, as it were. You get the chance to say, I don't really think that's where we're being led. And that's honored and respected. Or of another church sort of saying, you know, we would love to have you come nest with us, or we will love to. I mean, I've had a situation where a church was really asking to be adopted, but they wanted the bigger church to, well, change your name for us and maybe do this and that and the other for us. And it's like, no, we're kind of acquiring you. And so they had really different out of balance views of things, and we had to sort of work that out. I think it's important to tell any church that comes and says, we want to talk merger, saying, what other options have you looked at? Have you really looked at other things that are on your plate that could be other paths of sustainability for you? And so often we find that people jump to merger as a salvation point because they think we're dying, we need to be saved by merger, rather than looking at what other options they might have. So that's at one of the markers of an exit ramp too for us. So that's how we've addressed that.
Could you say that again? You're saying look at other models of
sustainability that are possible. I mean, this one up in Santa Rosa, I'm not going to use the M word with them until they use it. And I saw a sign of it. They're going to watch this video, so they're going to get the confession from me on this. the first sign I thought of, nope, they're going to be talking merger eventually. And they may merge, they may not, but I can see that it's no longer a 4-letter word for them. In that at the last meeting I had with them, we were talking about what could you do to make the others feel more welcomed and more a part of, the equality of this. And one of the I'll call it the host church, the Presbyterian church, the Lutherans had nested with them. A big sorrow of the Lutheran church was that they had really beautiful, not very huge even, but beautiful stained glass panels in their church. And they couldn't fathom destroying them. So they've been paying storage on them for all these years. We run into churches that are paying storage on pipe organs, for God's sakes. Stained glass, I can live with a little more than pipe organs, because nobody's looking to buy the pipe organs. But this was a member of the Presbyterian host church, if you will, saying, well, there's no reason in the world we couldn't put our minds together with some designer to find a way to build and incorporate your stained glass windows into our design, into this design. And I thought, there's the marker for me. It says, yeah, it's like, we're not just giving you a few drawers in the dresser kind of thing, but here's where you can hang your toothbrush. It's like, nope, you're going to start to make the statement. Like Kathy Hoop was talking about the signs or the pictures of the old pastors thing. He's like, tell both stories if you have to, but tell a wider story than just one. And that was a marker for me. But I think the overall thing that we sort of believe in PneuMatrix is build those exit ramps in. And it's a comfort level that let people trust the process, and that you're not pushing anyone towards any particular conclusion in that one.
Great.
Jim, do we have any other questions in there? Do you have, I like what you said. Yeah, grace is a good name, because it takes grace to get there with those mergers. It really does.
No, I think we pretty much covered the one.
I can't hear you.
Okay.
Now I really can't hear you.
Why? Now you can hear
now
me.
You can hear me.
No, I don't think there are any other specific questions. Anne had asked me privately earlier. I reached out to her to say, I can tell you about a Presbyterian UCC merger here in Sacramento. So I'm going to put her in touch with Bob Azzarito. So if any others of you would say, yeah, like, here's our situation. Do you know of anybody else out there that's kind of in this same niche, and could they be conversation partners with us? We always find that to be helpful, to not walk into the darkness alone, but holding hands.
Yeah. And this is what, above all the other models that we've done each week, this is the one that I think deserves the sense of mentoring and partnership, if we can arrange for that. Of people like, been there, done that, here's what you're going to experience. And so as we build the resource center, the toolkit for that one, we want to have some shared stories. I posted a link to the video that is on the Foundation for Grace in Tuscaloosa, like the one that I said Paul Greer wouldn't put a plug nickel on that it was going to work. I love that out of Paul. He doesn't make bad bets very often. But the notion of looking at other alternatives needs to be a part of that. It's, I guess you could say it's sort of the sit down of someone talking to a couple that wants to get married and saying, have you looked at every other possibility instead of this? Or have you looked at the idea of really discerning deeply what your DNA is about? Because I think any church that doesn't know its own DNA is not going to do well in a merger conversation. They're not going to know, as Kathy Hoop said, already know the answers to those deep questions. They need to be asking in the first phase those deep questions of themselves and figure out their own DNA coming forward. Who knew that they didn't object to being a progressive church? They just hadn't quite been challenged in that direction. I want to end up with thanking you all for the series. There are a number of you on here that I know that have come in every week, and to say that we will get back to you with the sense of what the resources are and where they're going to be archived so that everyone can use them. And then also, I've tried not to give plugs for PneuMatrix here, but there are a number of other groups that do great consulting around this. We happen to be pretty damn Presbyterian about our work. And we kind of know the DNA. Jim and I are old enough and been ordained for a bazillion years, so we kind of know the history and where to point you in the right direction. But there are steps. It's an organic process to go through a merger. You might go through, just like in couples, they might live together for a long time before then they decide to get married or whatever. And it's all good. And it's all sort of trying to see what is the best and highest calling of us in our churches as they are reforming and always being reformed. I thank you all for coming. I'd like to say that I'm sorry that we're at the end, but I'm a little tired. So I'll say the 8-week series is over and we will get back to you, but not till after Christmas. So have a really good season of Lent and enjoy. Oh, shoot. One other thing I was going to say in there that I forgot. The Lutheran and Presbyterian Church in Santa Rosa, this was about worship thing. What they did, I was going to say this to, I can't remember which person on the line. What they tried was they said, let's do a series of 4 worship services. One will be intentionally what a traditional Lutheran church worship looks like. One will be our version of a Lutheran worship service, because that's different from traditional. One will be a traditional Presbyterian worship service, and the other will be our version of Presbyterian. And they began to see the differences in all those rather than having sort of a straw dog image in their mind of what was what. I thought that was very valuable. So a good hint there. Again, thanks. And we'll see you on the other side of Christmas. Bye, folks. Thank you.